Welcome, everybody. I apologize for being late, but we had a series of votes that messed everything up a little bit, but we're not too late. But before I begin, I want to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, for a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. And I request unanimous consent that would permit members of the Commission to submit written testimony within the next 5 days.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for this important hearing on global gender-based violence. I want to thank J.P. Schuster and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing today's hearing. I also want to thank the International Rescue Committee for working with the Commission to organize this morning's excellent photo exhibit in the Rayburn Foyer. Some of these photos are set up around us in today's hearing room. These images are not only a powerful call to action, but they remind us of the extraordinary resilience of women and girls and their capacity to be powerful agents of change and peace in our societies. Finally, I want to thank our witnesses, especially those who traveled from Haiti and India, for being with us today. Monday, November 25th, is the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Over the past 2 decades, the international community has increasingly recognized gender-based violence, often called GBV, as a significant human rights and global health issue. GBV has many forms. It includes both random acts of violence as well as sustained abuse over time. It can include forced sex, physical violence, and psychological abuse. Some abuses are embedded in culture or tradition, such as the so-called honor killings or female genital mutilation. The trafficking of women and girls for labor and sex is an especially pervasive form of GBV worldwide. And it is important to note that GBV affects not only women, but also sexual attacks against men and boys. The United States is hardly exempt from gender-based violence and violence against women. According to the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence Against Women, nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men have been raped in their lifetime. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. Hundreds of thousands of American children each year are at risk of commercial sexual exploitation. Decades of investment in passing laws, supporting victims of violence, training advocates, lawyers, police, judges, teachers, doctors, nurses, and the public are finally beginning to change how victims of physical, psychological, and sexual violence are viewed by their communities and by medical, law enforcement, and legal professionals. And we still have a long way to go. In recent years, the U.S. and international community have increasingly confronted the problem of GBV in emergency situations such as violent conflict, war, and natural disasters. In such cases, vulnerable populations face an array of threats, including GBV, and often their governments, communities, and families fail to protect them. Refugees and the internally displaced and those attempting to return home can remain vulnerable for years in the wake of emergencies. Already, we are receiving reports of women and girls vulnerable to violence in the aftermath of the typhoon that just devastated the Philippines. The United States has made it a high priority to address GBV, especially in 2 of its egregious forms: trafficking in persons and female genital cutting. In August 2012, President Obama issued an executive order to launch a multi-year U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. This initiative builds on the U.S. National Action Plan on Peace and Security and other existing State Department and USAID policies on gender equality and women's empowerment. But the challenges to preventing GBV and providing adequate services to victims remain vast and complex. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, both systematic and opportunistic GBV continues to occur with extreme brutality. Adding to the challenge of addressing such attacks is concern that the DRC military has been the largest perpetrator of abuses. In October last year, the Commission heard from women's rights activists from Afghanistan, where legal protections for women remain limited, despite improvements since the fall of the Taliban in 2001. They voiced extreme concerns that I share, about the vulnerability of women and the loss of hard-earned gains for women's rights and the rights of girls as the U.S. withdraws the majority of its forces and the struggle over political power excludes the voices of many of the Afghan women. Like many around the world, I was shocked and I was horrified by the news of the ruthless gang rape and murder of a 23-year-old physiotherapy intern in New Delhi, India last December. Although that case received international attention, most GBV crimes in India are never reported, and many victims believe the legal system does not adequately protect them. In Haiti, incidents of GBV increased amid the insecurity, displacement, and lack of social services following the January 2010 earthquake. In addition, hundreds of thousands of children in Haiti have been trafficked for domestic slavery. Girls make up the vast majority of these children, who are known as restivex, and they are extremely vulnerable to sexual, physical, and psychological abuse in the households that they serve. We know that violence against women is also a weapon of war. In Colombia, unspeakable acts of violence have been commonplace against the women of that country, carried out by all the armed actors. The violence continues even after women and children are displaced or seek to rebuild their lives. Colombian women, like their counterparts around the world, are often leaders in their communities and neighborhoods, and therefore targets of threats and violence. But they are not just victims. They are leaders of change and reconciliation. This Friday, November 22nd, thousands of Colombian women will gather in Bogota to march in support of peace, an end to violence, justice, and reconciliation. I hope I speak for all of us here in this room when I say that we stand with these brave women as they unite for peace and an end to violence and conflict in Colombia. And before I turn to our witnesses, I'd like to yield to my colleague from Illinois, Representative Jan Schakowsky.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, not only for holding this hearing, but for your leadership and commitment to protecting the rights of women and girls around the world. I want to thank our both panels, but I especially want to give a greeting and gratitude to Kathy Russell, Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, and Carla Koppel, the Chief Strategy Officer, USAID. We know that violence against women is a humanitarian tragedy, a vicious crime, a global health catastrophe, a roadblock to social and economic development, and a threat to national security. The figures are staggering. I'm not going to go over them. We'll hear plenty of that today. The effects of violence are both lasting and profound. Sexual violence and the attached social stigma hinder the ability of women to fully participate in and contribute to their societies. Survivors of violence are less likely to hold jobs, more likely to live in poverty than other women. There's evidence linking sexual harassment and violence to low female enrollment and high dropout rates from secondary schools. Women living in the midst of armed conflict, poverty, and instability face a particularly desperate situation. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I went with Milan Verveer, where rape has been used for over a decade as a low-cost, low-tech, and horrifically effective weapon of war. In the DRC, sexual violence has been systematically used to destroy communities and to instill a sense of despair and hopelessness within a population. Hundreds of thousands of women have been raped. I want to commend the Obama administration for making this issue a priority. The administration's strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally and the accompanying executive order directing its implementation will help ensure that all relevant U.S. government entities are working together to end this global crisis. We can do more, and tomorrow I will reintroduce the International Violence Against Women Act to require the development and implementation of a comprehensive U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls internationally. IVAWA will promote health programs and survivor services, rule of law reform, and civil and criminal legal protections, educational opportunities for women and girls, and the promotion of economic opportunities for women. Passage of IVAWA, as I say, the International Violence Against Women Act, would give us critical tools in the fight against gender-based violence around the world. So, Mr. Chairman, All women deserve the same fundamental rights, including a freedom from violence and abuse, but passing this bill is not just the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. To borrow words from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who said a long time ago, women's rights are human rights, and no country, quote, she says, no country can succeed if half its population is left behind. It's no coincidence that the most dangerous places to be a woman are some of the most unstable and violent regions of the world. Studies have proven that investing in women and protecting their fundamental rights strengthens entire communities. Combating violence against women is a critical step toward promoting regional and global stability. As my leader, Nancy Pelosi, has said, in the United States, when women succeed, America succeeds. I think it is also true when women succeed, the world succeeds. So I want to thank you again for holding this hearing. Look forward to our witnesses.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your statement, and I would like to submit into the record any written testimony provided by the witnesses, but I'd also like to submit the following statements for the record. The statement of Esther Solar, President and Founder of Futures Without Violence, the statement of Ms. Wang Chunying, the statement of Ms. Ma Chun Mai, and again, I want to thank the International Rescue Committee again for their support. And again, if you haven't had a chance to look at some of these photographs and the captions that go along with them, please, when this hearing is over with, do that. They're incredibly inspiring, and they give me great hope because these women in very difficult situations are, want to be the future leaders of their country. They're aiming high. They want to be journalists and doctors, and they want to help improve the quality of life in their communities. And I found it really uplifting and inspiring. There are a lot of people in this audience here who have been working on these issues for many, many years. I'm very grateful for that. My friend Catherine Porter is here, who was one of the one of the founders of this commission that we now are able to have to conduct hearings on human rights. So we appreciate her support. And our first two witnesses will be Catherine Russell, the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the Department of State, and also Carla Coppell, the Chief Strategy Officer at USAID, former Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. We are thrilled that you are both here. And Ambassador Russell, we will begin with you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Representative Schakowsky, thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you both very much for your leadership and for calling this hearing. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm honored to be here with all of you to discuss this critical importance of preventing and responding to gender-based violence globally. I'd like to express my appreciation to the Commission for your commitment to promote and defend international human rights, including women's rights. It's fitting that we gather now to discuss these issues, as Monday marks the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the first of 16 days campaign against gender violence, which concludes on Human Rights Day, December 10th. My job as Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues is to promote the principle that advancing the status of women and girls is essential to achieving America's diplomatic goals, that peace, security, prosperity, economic growth cannot be achieved without the full and equal participation of women, and that men and boys are important partners in this effort. Violence against women and girls is a global epidemic. It crosses every social and economic class, ethnicity, race, religion, and education level, and transcends international borders. It takes the form of early and forced marriages, sexual violence, and traditional harmful practices, among others. Violence occurs both outside and inside the home and often increases with instability. For example, we see heightened levels of gender-based violence in conflict and post-conflict settings, in refugee and displaced person camps, and following natural disasters. The use of rape as a tactic of war is yet another egregious form of gender-based violence that disproportionately affects women and girls. Worldwide, an estimated 1 in 3 women will be physically or sexually abused in her lifetime, and 1 in 5 will experience rape or attempted rape. As you said, this is completely unacceptable. Gender-based violence is also a public health challenge and a barrier to social, political, and economic participation. It undermines the dignity, overall health status, and human rights of the millions of individuals who experience it, as well as the public health, economic stability, and security of nations. That's why addressing gender-based violence is a cornerstone of this administration's efforts to promote women's empowerment and gender equality around the world. While serving as Chief of Staff to Dr. Jill Biden, I led an interagency effort to develop the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. This administration launched that report in August of 2012. It's my hope that this strategy and the accompanying executive order from the President will make a significant difference in our efforts to ensure that all persons can live free from violence. This work also complements and builds upon the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which aims to protect women and advance their participation in conflict, post-conflict, and relief and recovery settings. It's estimated that women and children make up more than 75% of displaced populations worldwide. At the UN General Assembly this year, Secretary Kerry announced Safe from the Start, an initiative to prioritize the needs of women and children at the onset of emergencies. With an initial funding commitment of $10 million, this new state USAID initiative will assess and address the needs of women and girls in emergencies. We've also been working closely with other donor countries around the world, including the UK, to advance this policy priority, including through coordination on the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, and through Secretary Kerry's recent announcement that the U.S. will chair the call to action to address violence against women and girls in emergencies this coming year. Whether we're responding to the link between violence and HIV/AIDS as part of PEPFAR, stemming the tide of trafficking in persons, responding to humanitarian crises, providing training to law enforcement and judges, or engaging with civil society, we factor in the concerns of women and seek ways to provide support to survivors and activists working to address violence. In partnership with our friends at USAID, the State Department supports efforts to help local governments investigate and prosecute crimes of gender-based violence. We provide legal and psychological services to survivors, support prevention efforts by educating communities and engaging with critical stakeholders, including men, boys, and religious leaders, and we support capacity building to enhance the ability of the media and civil society to address these issues. We also work with private sector to identify creative and innovative programs to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. We work to create opportunities through investing in education and entrepreneurship that will help women and girls overcome barriers and empower them to be less vulnerable to violence, exploitation, brutality, and abuse. I want you to know that I'm personally committed to this effort, and I will use all the resources at our disposal to reduce the problem of violence. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I believe this is true for women worldwide. All around the world, governments and people are beginning to recognize that global stability, peace, and prosperity depend on protecting and advancing the rights of women and girls. This is certainly not to say that every day there are not millions of women whose potentials are stifled by violence, by early and forced marriage, by misguided notions of honor and traditional harmful practices, or by barriers to education, credit, and equal rights under the law. But we have seen that when a girl has the chance to go to school, has access to health care, and is kept safe from violence, she will marry later, have healthier children, and earn an income that she will invest back into her family and community, breaking the cycle of poverty. We've seen that integrating women's perspectives into peace negotiations and security efforts help prevent conflict and can lead to more durable peace agreements. And we've seen women entrepreneurs lifting up families and entire communities. We have seen what is possible. We know that empowering women and protecting them from violence will lead to stronger families, stronger communities, and stronger nations. I look forward to working with all of you to further this effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Capel?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the Commission. I want to thank the Commission for highlighting today the problem of gender-based violence, as well as the good work being done at USAID, by our colleagues at the State Department, and by non-governmental organizations here today as well. As you, the Chairman, and Commission Member Schakowsky and Ambassador Russell have eloquently noted already, gender-based violence is a terrible epidemic. For me personally, I would just say that it is appalling that 38% of murders of women globally are reportedly committed by their intimate partners, that some 10 million girls per year are married every year before they reach the age of 18, and that almost 50% of all sexual assaults worldwide are against girls 15 years and younger. And I think that it's critical that we recognize that women with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer abuse, and that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons are also facing heightened risk. To shine a spotlight particularly on the consequences of this for development, USAID undertook a study in Bangladesh that found that actually the cost of domestic violence alone was equivalent to 2% of the country's gross domestic product, nearly equal to the amount of the government's annual expenditures in health and nutrition. And the United Nations Secretary General 2005 study on violence against women calculated that gender-based violence in just 13 countries costs us some $50 billion. So the consequences of gender-based violence are individual, at the community level, to nations, and to the global community. And while USAID has worked to prevent and combat gender-based violence for over 2 decades, under the Obama administration, the U.S. has put gender equality and the advancement of women and girls at the forefront of U.S. policy. A range of policies and strategies align with the proposed International Violence Against Women Act, and much of our activity is consistent with its spirit. Over the last 2 years, USAID has reinvigorated and strengthened its work on gender equality and women's empowerment. Ambassador Russell mentioned the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, as well as the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. Those have been also coupled with the U.S. Government Action Plan on Children in Adversity, the USAID Counter-Trafficking in Persons Policy, the USAID Gender Equality and Female Empowerment Policy, as well as our vision for ending child marriage and addressing the needs of married adolescents. Each of these policies and strategies is synergistic and complementary, places gender-based violence prevention and response as a prominent focal area for work, and provides a foundation for robust action. Overall, emphasis is placed on concerted efforts to strategically address the epidemic, integration of attention to gender-based violence throughout programming, whether sector programming related to development or humanitarian relief, and peace-building efforts. Having created what I would say is a very robust foundation, we're firmly focused on implementation, which consists of several components. Whether that's staff training, and we've trained over 1,000 of our staff, whether in person or online, and we've trained around our gender equality policy, and over 500 personnel on our counter-trafficking in persons code of conduct. Whether that is through the online mandatory modules we've put in place for all staff to ensure that they're paying attention, or through the services and technical assistance that involved setting aside additional operating funds to enable travel in support of gender-based violence-related programming. Whether it is related to amending our automated directive system, which is a system of policies and procedures to align with all those policies and strategies and ensure that the commitments we have on paper become real in terms of program. Whether that's in terms of our reporting requirements, where we have now put in place a series of indicators, several of them mandatory, 3 specifically related to gender-based violence, to track and account for our work and the impact of that work around the world. Or whether that's through the creation of incentive funding programs in 2013, through which we've providing 7 new missions with additional funding in support of work on gender-based violence. Programs in countries including Ethiopia, Georgia, India, Zimbabwe, Guinea, South Africa, and Kenya. For me, it's particularly appealing to come in and talk to you a little bit about and highlight some of the programs that we feel are most effectively doing the work to combat, prevent, and respond to different forms of gender-based violence around the world. Some programs focus specifically on issues related to gender-based violence, such as child marriage. So there's the Safe Age of Marriage project in Yemen, which uses awareness-raising sessions and in schools, mobile clinics, and community venues, and actually has seen the reported age of marriage rise from 10 to 17 to 14 to 17, from 10 to 17, with real results and implications for health, education, and the well-being of these women and girls. But I want to focus particularly on programs that are showing how we can integrate attention to gender-based violence in various sectors, because that really is the thrust of where we're moving. So, for example, in the health sector, we look at the Meseret Hawat program in Ethiopia, which leverages funds from the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, in Ethiopia's Amhara region, and has reached over 220,000 married adolescent girls who have been involved in girl groups, and has a parallel program called Addis Birhan that has reached married adolescent boys. Because, as Ambassador Russell has said, it's essential to work with both males and females in combating this epidemic. or whether it's our rule of law, democracy, rights, and governance programs, which show how effective interventions around gender-based violence can be. In Guatemala, where we've provided technical assistance and material support for the 24-hour court, which has already, since opening its doors in October 2012, has already issued over 800 protection measures for women, over 300 arrest warrants, and in total over 125 people sent to prison when previously there was no record of prosecution for these kinds of abuse. Or in Ethiopia, where we've worked with village elders, the Ethiopian Women Lawyers Association, and the Ministry of Justice to raise awareness about harmful traditional practices such as early marriage and female genital cutting, which resulted, advocacy work that resulted actually in the ratification of a new law that increased the legal age of marriage from 16 to 18. We also have looked at programs like our Safe Schools pilot, which started in Ghana and Malawi, but has now been replicated in Dominican Republic, Senegal, Yemen, Tajikistan, and DRC. And what we've seen is already changes in attitudes and beliefs relating to whether or not sexual harassment was permissible, which we feel is the first step towards prevention. We've also formed a partnership today with the Peace Corps to use the Safe Schools material and train volunteers to create a safe classroom environment and to integrate gender equitable practices into their teaching and classroom management. The same could be said around economic growth. Where in South Africa, for example, we have an intervention with microfinance for AIDS and gender equity project, which is really focusing on how microfinance schemes and awareness raising can work together to decrease the risk of intimate partner violence, and is now reaching tens of thousands of households and has been progressively and cautiously scaled up. Or in our programs to promote the use of innovation and technology, where, for example, in India, we're expanding the use of innovative ComCare mobile technology to enable and monitoring, identification, counseling, and referral of gender-based violence cases to municipal primary health care centers, or launching the Counter Trafficking in Persons Campus Challenge Tech Contest, which has created a community of over 2,000 students from around the world who are exploring innovative technological solutions to combating trafficking in persons. Ambassador Russell referred to, and I just want to amplify the emphasis on gender-based violence in situations of crisis and conflict, because it's a serious concern. And so in Syria, currently, we're supporting medical services for GBV survivors through women's health centers, mobile clinics, and outreach teams that provide services to women who desperately need it. In response to the typhoon in the Philippines, we're working with our humanitarian partners to identify and mitigate protection risks through health, food, relief commodities, and water sanitation and hygiene assistance activities. And our disaster resistance response team is closely monitoring protection risks and has a specific protection advisor to support partners in addressing all of these concerns. And we're very fortunate to be working with the Department of State on implementation and realization of Safe from the Start. In the past year, USAID programs have reached over 1 million survivors of gender-based violence and girls at risk of violence. I do also want to note the strong connection between today's topic and the women's participation and empowerment within decision-making processes. As Ambassador Russell said, we know that women's participation will broaden the scope of peace agreements and increase the likelihood that gender-based violence is addressed. Through our Global Women's Leadership Fund, we've already been working with women in Cote d'Ivoire, Burma, Libya, Yemen, and Syria to ensure that their voices are heard and that they can pave the way for addressing gender-based violence throughout. So a great deal is underway, and yet there's much that still needs to be done. We've developed a critical priority country list based on prevalence data as well as information about the ability of countries to move this agenda forward. Those countries will now be examining the extent to which their investments are strategic and need to be augmented. We're harvesting results through our demographic and health survey as well as programs that are on the ground to see whether or not what works and how it's effective and with what impact on the ground, and we look forward to using that to help us scale up interventions and move those forward. And finally, a robust research agenda is helping us figure out the kinds of interventions that are most important, have the biggest results on the ground, and will allow us to really staunch the trend towards increased gender-based violence in many of the countries around the world where we're working. In closing, USAID is hard at work refining our tools and interventions to effectively address gender-based violence. We appreciate the contributions of many of our colleagues who are in this room as we fight this epidemic, which undermines development and offends human dignity. Thank you for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you both for your testimony, and let me also ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement entitled "Afro-Colombian Women Refuse to Continue Being Unarmed Victims." I know that you're on a timetable, so I'm going to ask some questions quickly, and they may not necessarily be in the order that I would originally have done so. But we're going to hear from a witness from Haiti on the second panel. The Restavik or child slavery system in Haiti entails young children being sent from their homes to live in domestic servitude with other families, and often the system prevents young girls and boys from going to school and can expose them to multiple forms of violence. The causes and consequences of the Restavik system are directly related to economic, political, and social issues throughout the country. How is the Restavik issue being addressed throughout U.S. foreign assistance to Haiti, not just through the child protection programming, but as part of initiatives related to economic opportunity, access to education, and political participation? Ms. Capel, you may want to.
Sure. So there have been, the response to Haiti with regard to gender-based violence is one that is growing in its amplitude. I was in Haiti several months ago and was very interesting to visit the health, education, and economic development programs and see the willingness and interest in integrating comprehensive attention to gender-based violence into the portfolio. As you perhaps know from the start of the crisis in Haiti post-earthquake, there was attention focused on how we could set up the camps for displaced people in ways that would reduce the risk of gender-based violence. And since then, we've been looking at different strategies for addressing that problem and ensuring that it's built in and baked into our interventions. So, for example, when I visited one program that was a healthcare facility, they talked about microfinance enabling people who are at risk, such as prostitutes, from not moving back into that business at increased risk for gender-based violence, as well as health consequences, and moving that forward. The Safe Schools program that I discussed earlier in my testimony is one that we're looking at replicating and integrating into education sector interventions in Haiti. So it's something that is part and parcel of interventions in a range of different sectors, and we foresee increased attention on that problem.
Yeah, because this is an issue. When I was in Haiti, I heard a lot about. I was actually not down there looking at this stuff. I was looking at. I was visiting an orphanage in Haiti, but this seems to be a major issue that. And again, given the fact that we're also this country's so involved in helping rebuild Haiti, and this practice, this so-called Restavik system, is so outrageous that it seems that we have some leverage here. And obviously, you're talking about some ways to deal with it, but I mean, it's just it really is quite horrendous. And we're going to hear from a witness a little while later. Maybe for both of you here, what role can men and boys play in preventing gender-based violence? To what extent does the international community address boys and men as victims of gender-based violence? And in your view, do the current U.S. and international programs that combat violence against women sufficiently address the role of men and boys as either perpetrators or as victims of abuse? Ambassador?
Well, I would say that there's been growing awareness that men and boys are critical in all of this programming. I just returned from Afghanistan, and we have a lot of focus there, of course, on women and girls in our programming, but it was clear to me and clear to everyone that I spoke to that doing the sort of the next generation of boys are critically important in making sure that they understand. You can't just talk to the girls and the women about violence. You have to talk to the boys. You have to educate the boys about the value of girls, the value of women. And if you don't do that, you'll never be successful. And I think that throughout our programming, we are certainly aware of that. And I think it's a place where we're doing more and more of it. I think Carla can probably speak to the specifics of how much programming they're doing on that. But I think it's become, on the policy side, clear to us that there's sort of no end to how much we should be doing. And I certainly think that we're doing on the men's side, we're doing a lot of training of police and things like that, but I think just the sort of general awareness for boys and men about the importance of valuing women and treating them well is something that we're all very aware of, and I think, as I said, doing more and more of that training.
I think I would agree with everything that the ambassador has said. I think we also need there's a growing recognition that we need to work with families and communities as a whole, that men are perpetrators and victims. They're also key allies and decision makers, and they are influencers. And whether that's looking at actors within faith-based communities, within the justice system, within governance structures, that they are the people that help us make change, and that we need to work with them at all levels of intervention.
You mentioned a number of executive orders or policy directives that the administration has kind of issued to address the well-being of women, including the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, the National Action Plan on Women's Peace and Security, and policies on gender equality and women's empowerment at both USAID and at the State Department. I mean, how do these documents all relate to one another, and what is the status of their implementation, and what are the obstacles that the administration has to face when they implement these policies?
Go ahead. Do you want me?
Either one, yeah, well, either or both.
So all of the policies and strategies create a frame where there previously was none. When we started a little less than 3 years ago, we had a 20-year-old gender equality and we had a women in development policy that was very outdated. What we've created, we think, is a very solid foundation that speaks to different aspects of this problem, recognizing that gender-based violence weaves throughout all of them. With that in mind, we sort of feel like we have enough of a frame, enough strategies and policies, and we need to move it forward. And from our perspective, what's required to move it forward is training and capacity building for staff, the policies and the regulations for implementing all of those, and we're moving forward with that, incentive funds to enable and provide the technical assistance and shape projects and programs, and we've made those available, and increased ability to have the research that fills knowledge gaps, because the reality is there's a great deal that we don't know, both in terms of gaps in terms of data on prevalence, as well as the interventions that will work. So one example is we talk about women's economic empowerment as a critical priority, and yet we know that if we approach women's economic empowerment in the wrong way, it can actually increase the propensity to gender-based violence. So as we implement as we implement women's economic empowerment programs, we want to do it in ways that reduce the threat of gender-based violence that comes with empowerment and doesn't have any unintended negative consequences. And those are the kinds of research that we need to do as we move to implement.
One thing I would add to that is that one of the main purposes of the strategy on gender-based violence was to make sure that the very limited resources that we have in the government were being used wisely, and that we, to the extent that we could, we were not duplicating efforts. And what we found was that when we brought all of the relevant players together in the government and got everyone together and figured out what everybody was doing, there was a lot of very good sort of synergy and excitement about working together. And I think that that's been really one of the most remarkable sort of developments from our perspective, of getting everybody in the same place, sort of moving everybody in the same direction. And I think that it's making us all work a little bit more effectively, which I think is all to the good.
Well, this brings me to my last question. I mean, one of the things that we do, in addition to kind of highlighting human rights issues, and we look for ways that we can be helpful so that we can steer our colleagues in a direction where we're actually doing something constructive, which is sometimes not easy to do. But what is it that we can do here more? Is it funding? Is it do we need to do anything legislatively? Is there something that we can do to help kind of advance your agenda? Because I mean, I think I speak for my colleague from Illinois. I think we admire the work that you're doing, and we support the work you're doing. We want to make sure it's effective. We want to make sure it's implemented. We want to make sure that these issues are tackled with sooner rather than later, and that we have effective strategies. So what is it that we can do here to help you in your work?
Well, I would say that two very important things. One is to stay engaged as you are, because I think your paying attention is critically important and makes a huge difference to what we're doing. Because sometimes I think, not to beat a dead horse, but literally coming back from this Afghanistan trip, there's so much concern there that we are going to, especially among the women that I met, that the United States is going to forget them and forget the strides that they've made. And so I think to the extent that you continue to pay attention to that and don't forget the women who are there, I think that will help them tremendously. And I think paying attention to the issue generally by doing things like this, holding hearings like this, is tremendously helpful, because I think as much as we live this issue every day, people in the country, I think, you know, they're busy doing their own things. They don't, it's hard to follow this every day. It's not what people do. But I think when you bring the great attention that you can to this issue, I think that's tremendously helpful to the Congress and to the women who are facing these problems around the world, because I think it really illustrates the fact that the United States is a leader on these issues and can play a powerful role in bringing other countries to the table, and also just making a difference in getting this issue dealt with appropriately. And the second thing is, I do think, you know, we're always happy to have any funding that you'd like to send our way. So I think it's incumbent upon us, obviously, to use that funding well. And I think it's important for us to stay in touch and work together on that and make sure that we're doing things. And I think it's important for us to have a strong relationship, so you understand what we're doing, what AID is doing with the money, so that you see that it makes sense. But, you know, certainly there are lots of things that we could do in addition to what we're doing.
I think I can't emphasize enough how important it is to hold hearings like this. I mean, you can see from the number of people here today that there's more interest than there are hearings of this sort. The other thing I would emphasize is you holding us accountable. And when I say us, I mean the U.S. government. As you said, we have now a raft of executive orders, policies, and strategies. They're relatively new, and we can talk about what we're doing, but it's not completely implemented yet, and it's not comprehensive, and we want it to get legs for the long term. And that will require it being about the continuity and making this woven into the DNA of the work of the U.S. government. And that only happens from continuing to be held accountable to these policies and strategies as we move forward.
And perhaps we can maybe call you back at some point and, you know, get a status report. And just one final thing. You know, you mentioned, I know that you recently visited Afghanistan, Ambassador, and, you know, I think we're equally concerned about the fate of a lot of women, you know, as the U.S. draws down. I mean, there are some of us, I'll speak for myself, who you know, who do want to draw down, who don't want to be there militarily forever. And it would be helpful to us in the coming weeks and months if you can help us identify areas that we can be helpful, other than keeping U.S. troops there forever and ever and ever. There have to, you know, whether it's in terms of funding, or whether it's in terms of, you know, highlighting some of the progress that's being made or some of the programs that are there. I want you to feel free to contact us with some ideas on ways that we can be helpful, because we're deeply concerned about that issue as well. So.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know that the women appreciate that too, because I think they have made incredible strides with a lot of help from the United States, and they are. I had a meeting the other day with Representative Schakowsky, and she and I talked about this as well, that they are afraid of what's coming, and I think they want to know that we're still with them, and I assured them that we are. There is a lot of interest from AID and a big commitment from AID going forward, but I think we need to just keep our eye on the ball. I think that's the most important thing, and so your interest is tremendously helpful, and I will definitely come back to you with any. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'd like to think, after all the money we have spent on that in that government over there, that perhaps we can get some commitment from the government as we draw down, that they will respect some of the strides that women made. I mean, I don't think that's something we ought to be able to hold them accountable on.
Well, I agree, and I think, you know, it goes to the point that we believe that women, the success of that country, we believe, is based on the involvement of women in that country. So it's critically important that that happens.
Jan?
Well, let me suggest to my colleague one of the ways that I think we can be helpful and all members can be helpful is to pass the International Violence Against Women Act, which is being introduced tomorrow. And really, it's been a coalition effort. 52 organizations have participated in the language, and I know that, Ambassador, you worked on a very early version years ago on the International Violence Against Women Act, and one of the things it would do would be to codify, to make permanent the office of the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, and also the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID. So it wouldn't depend on any particular administration, but that those offices would be in place, and has some very specific strategies. But let me ask you, given our current situation, something about the funding. Where did it just go? So we know that foreign assistance is always targeted for budget cuts, and there's countless studies after study after study showing that the American people grossly overestimate how much we actually spend on foreign aid. And I'm just wondering how much the mandatory spending cuts under sequestration, the across-the-board cuts, as well as other budget cuts in recent years, affect our ability to promote the rights of women and girls around the world. And either one of you.
I'd have to get back to you with a specific quantification. I mean, obviously, any reduction in funding is a reduction in funding. That said, we've worked very hard to integrate attention to gender equality and women's empowerment issues into sector programs to a larger extent. And so it's difficult to juxtapose that increase in emphasis and then see where you come out in terms of a decrease as a result of funding, because I honestly believe we're doing much more for women and girls in many ways than we were just a few years ago.
You know, there's the potential for further budget cuts along the way. Wondered if you wanted to comment on funding at all, Ambassador.
Well, I think my general point would be what I made earlier, which is that to the extent that we're investing in women and girls, I think it's a well-established and great investment for the United States, because the payback in terms of the stability that it creates in the countries that we are investing in is tremendously helpful for the United States, and it's a smart strategic decision for us. And I think that's why both the President and the Secretary believe so strongly in investing in women. And so I think certainly any move to cut back on funding for women would be, in my mind, just foolish. It would hurt us in the long run, and hopefully we won't get to the point where we do anything like that. I think it would really hurt us.
You know, for so many years, decades really, there's again been study after study about how if you want real bang for your buck, internationally and at home as well, invest in women if you want more stability, if you want a more prosperous country, less violent country in general. You want to invest in women, and yet often if you look at international budgets, that truth is not followed by investment sufficient to the outcomes that we could really have. And so that's why I'm really happy, and maybe you want to say something more. It sounds like you've developed some measurement tools. I think it's really important for us to be able to explain the outcomes, quantify the value of our investments, and be able to make a really strong case about how useful investing in women and girls really is. I don't know if you want to comment any more on that.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think where we are now is that we need to find the specific results for our investments, and that's what will make these investments self-perpetuating. So we've created, for example, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which looks specifically at whether our Feed the Future program is empowering women as part of agricultural investments, recognizing, as the Food and Agriculture Organization has found, that we could feed 150 million more people if women had the same access to inputs, female farmers, that men do. That the differentiation in terms of yields is simply due to a lack of access to seed, fertilizer, capital, and extension services. And so that index is a way we hold ourselves accountable for progress on that metric. When we look at our Development Credit Authority, we're now tracking the extent to which we're serving male versus female borrowers, because we know female borrowers pay back at a higher rate, and we want to make sure that gender blind doesn't mean you're not serving women because you didn't notice that they weren't part of the borrowing pool. So I agree with you entirely, and my hope is that by putting in place these systems for tracking uniformly across our work globally, we will get a very, very robust baseline of information about the projects that deliver the kinds of results we want to see and what kind of value we're getting for money.
Ambassador, do you want to say anything about that?
No, I agree totally with what Carla is saying. I think that, all the studies that we've seen from the World Bank and other places say that investing in women is a smart decision to make because women take the money. They first, as Carla said, they pay back loans in higher numbers. The money that they get, they invest in their families so that they get their children immunized. They send their girls to school and their other children to school so that it's a better investment overall. Their communities do better, and we would argue that their countries do better. So we think anecdotally that there's no question that it does better, that it's a better investment. The World Bank agrees with that, but I think the next step for us is, as Carla says, to take that and look at our actual, our policies and our investments and make sure that we're seeing that same statistical evidence. And I think, Carla raises a really interesting point, which is when we do these, sometimes or in the past, we haven't always broken things out by gender. So we wouldn't look at loans that way because it just isn't the way we would do it. And so we didn't have the data to say that men or women paid things back at the same or different rates. And so I think now we're looking at that. So I think as we go forward, we'll have a lot more data.
I think that kind of data collection not only helps to justify the programs we have, but then compare to other spending how much or little we're actually directing toward women.
Exactly.
Because the evidence is just totally conclusive.
Exactly.
Unquestionable that when you make those investments, and if we're not doing a sufficient amount relative to other expenditures, then we can make the case for
more.
demanding more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right.
I yield back. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both, and let me also thank you for, I want to take this opportunity to thank USAID, too, for the work that you're doing on Feed the Future, which is, I deal a lot with the issues of hunger and food insecurity globally, and I'm inspired by what the state and USAID are doing in terms of approaching agricultural development in a different way, actually discovering that there's such a thing as women, and that we ought to invest in them, and that it's a good investment, and understanding the importance of building local capacity and education and good nutrition, and this, and I'll just say this. I wish that story were told to people who are not on the relevant committees that oversee this, because I think there's a lot of ignorance in Congress as to the incredible and exciting things that are going on in development, and not only in terms of combating gender-based violence, but in terms of creating local economies. And so I'm a big booster of Feed the Future, and of the work that you're doing, and we look forward to having a close collaboration here and figuring out ways we can help assist you. We'll fight the money battles, not always be successful, but certainly I think the more people realize the progress that is being made, I think the more people are going to be willing to step up to the plate and provide the assistance you need and deserve. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
I know we went a little bit over with, but I apologize, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much.
So we will now call our next panel, Francisca Vigo Walsh, Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer of Women's Protection and Empowerment Unit with the International Rescue Committee, Ravi Kant, who's the President of the Board of Directors of the Shakti Vahini in New Delhi, India, Christina Finch, Managing Director, Women's Human Rights Program, Amnesty International USA, and Gerda Constant, the Executive Director of Fondation Limie Lavi in Haiti. And I hope I pronounced that all right. So why don't we begin? Why don't we begin with Christina? Christina Finch. Thank you for being here. We will begin with you, and welcome, everybody welcome. And we're going to make sure everybody's microphones are working too. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Good. Welcome. I don't think your microphone's not on there. There we go.
Apologies.
There you go.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and members of the Commission, and to the staff of the Commission for their hard work to hold this hearing, and the leadership of the Commission to help end gender-based violence globally. Amnesty International USA is pleased to testify at this important and timely hearing. Today, I'd like to focus my testimony on the international human rights framework that exists to address gender-based violence and offer recommendations on concrete actions that the United States government can take to help prevent and end the violence. Our organization's campaigns to end gender-based violence around the world have produced hundreds of reports documenting these human rights abuses, offered detailed recommendations for actions by government, non-state actors, and international organizations, and clearly illustrated the connection between this violence and other violations of human rights around the world. Amnesty International's two most recent reports focus on violations in Syria and Egypt. Violence against women takes many forms, including rape, domestic violence, female genital mutilation, and acid attacks, to name a few. It's a global human rights crisis that exacerbates instability and insecurity around the world. But it is also an issue that affects individual women intimately. UN statistics show that 1 in 3 women will be raped, beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused during her lifetime. A shocking number, and in my opinion, a vast underestimation of the true number of women affected. I count myself among those women. As a survivor of gender-based violence myself, I know firsthand the effects that this violence can and does have on women's lives and the lives of those around them. Over the last 25 years, violence against women has been increasingly understood and accepted as a human rights issue. Whereas violence was previously dismissed as an unpreventable consequence of war, cultural norm, or simply a private matter, the international community has acknowledged that women and girls are often targets of abuse because of their gender, whether in conflict, where rape is used as a weapon of war, in communities or schools, or in the home, where violence occurs in the family. These crimes are now recognized as human rights abuses that cannot be justified by war, culture, tradition, and which governments must prevent, prohibit, and punish. The rights of all women as human beings around the world were first and most fundamentally recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Adopted in 1948 by the UN General Assembly, the UDHR states in clear and simple terms rights that belong equally to all people in all nations, without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, or any other status. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the CEDAW Treaty, is the first and only international treaty to comprehensively address women's rights within the political, cultural, economic, social, and family spheres. Other international instruments and resolutions address specific aspects of women's human rights, including the 1993 UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which sets forth ways in which governments should act to prevent violence, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which was the first international treaty to identify crimes against women as crimes against humanity, war crimes, and in some instances, genocide, the Geneva Conventions, which designate rape and other acts of sexual violence as war crimes and grave breaches of the Convention, the UN Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, and finally, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent related resolutions, which emphasize the responsibility of all states to put an end to impunity and violence and to prosecute those responsible for war crimes relating to sexual and other violence against women. The ways in which women experience human rights abuses are unique. While human rights are often understood as the rights that everyone has by virtue of their humanity, the assumption that all humans have the same experiences and needs is particularly problematic for women. Historically, states have assumed responsibility for human rights violations only when state agents or officials were the perpetrators. However, women more often face abuses from non-state actors, such as their employers, their partners, their husbands, families, friends, and community members. It's critical to note that whether abuses against women are committed by state or non-state actors, in the public or the private spheres, the state is obliged to condemn, prevent, and punish all acts of violence against women and take measures to empower women. Human rights abuses against women are often complicated by further discrimination on the grounds of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, caste, culture, or age. The type and prevalence of violence and discrimination that women experience are often determined by how their gender interacts with these and other factors. Amnesty International USA urges the United States to take concrete policy steps to help end gender-based violence globally. We see progress on two of our past recommendations to the Commission: the promulgation of both a U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, and a U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. But much work remains to be done. Amnesty International has recommended 4 U.S. policy initiatives which will make a significant impact in the work to end gender-based violence globally. These are passage of the Women, Peace, and Security Act, U.S. promotion of reform of laws and policies that discriminate against women and girls, U.S. ratification of the CEDAW Treaty, and finally, passage of the International Violence Against Women Act, which would make ending violence against women and girls a top U.S. diplomatic and foreign assistance priority. The act would codify and implement the U.S. strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. The act provides a comprehensive framework which would support survivors, hold perpetrators accountable, and prevent violence while ensuring that U.S. foreign aid is used in the most cost-effective and impactful way possible. Amnesty's recent report on Egyptian women provides us with a poignant example of why this legislation is necessary. Dalia Abdel Wahab went to Tahrir Square in Cairo on January 25th to exercise her right to protest. Dalia's life was threatened as she was beaten and sexually assaulted by a mob of men. Like the many other women who have faced gender-based violence while peacefully protesting in Tahrir Square, her attackers have not been brought to justice. A life free from violence is a fundamental human right, yet nearly 1 billion women around the world will not have that freedom. To effect real change in the lives of women globally, action is needed now, and the United States must continue to be a leader on this issue by passing legislation such as the International Violence Against Women Act. Chairman McGovern, Congresswoman Schakowsky, and members of the Commission, on behalf of Dalia, myself, and the nearly 1 billion women around the world who have experienced gender-based violence, I thank you for holding this important hearing and urge you to take swift action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent testimony. We'll now hear from Francisca Vigo Walsh. Did I pronounce that properly?
Perfectly.
Thank you. Turn your microphone on there. There we go.
Mr. Chairman, I request that my written testimony be submitted for the record.
Without
please.
objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Wolf and Chairman McGovern, for calling this important hearing on the global threat that gender-based violence poses. I also thank Representative Schakowsky, whose support for making violence against women and girls a foreign policy priority of the United States has never waned. I'd also like to take a moment to express my condolences to the Commission members for the loss of Mr. Donald Payne, who was a tireless advocate for GBV survivors in the Democratic Republic of Congo. His loss is felt in the humanitarian and policy community. During the course of my testimony, you will hear why it is critical to take bold action now to work towards a day when women and girls live free from violence. We are grateful to the U.S. government for its role in helping to achieve this goal. My name is Francisca Vigo Walsh, and I am the IRC's Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer for Women's Protection and Empowerment. The IRC is a humanitarian aid organization working in over 40 countries. We are also supported by the U.S. Refugee Program to assist refugees arriving in the United States resettle and achieve self-sufficiency. The IRC has gained a reputation for being a pioneer in the GBV field. Since we started our first program in 1996 in refugee camps in Tanzania, we have grown to become the only humanitarian agency with a technical division dedicated exclusively to working on violence against women and girls. On behalf of the thousands of women and girls with whom we work, the IRC thanks you. We have learned a lot from our near 20 years of experience, and I'd like to take my time to communicate here on this floor 3 key messages. 1, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing gender-based violence. 2, responding to gender-based violence in emergencies is life-saving. It is not optional. And the U.S. government has the opportunity now to revolutionize humanitarian aid. First off, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Women and girls face myriad forms of violence in conflict settings. It is not just rape. The IRC has supported over 22,000 survivors of violence in just a fraction of the countries where we work in the past 3 years. 48% of these survivors came through our doors because of intimate partner or domestic violence. Much of our work to better understand the different needs of survivors based on their age and the form of abuse that they've been subjected to has been possible because of the support of the U.S. government. For example, we developed, with funding from the Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration, the Caring for Child Survivors Guidelines, which provides targeted guidance to field staff working with child survivors in conflict and post-conflict settings. These guidelines have influenced global policy and guidance for working with children. Most recently, they informed PEPFAR technical guidelines for clinical care of children and adolescents who have experienced sexual violence. The IRC knows that interventions to prevent and respond to gender-based violence are effective. For example, the IRC with Johns Hopkins University tested a mental health treatment for survivors of rape who were receiving case management services with us. In only 12 weeks of cognitive processing therapy administered by trained caseworkers, that's to say, no clinicians, no significant overhead costs, we learned that the vast majority overcame crippling depression and anxiety. 63% reported decreased symptoms of depression, and 90% reported a marked increase in daily functioning. These results were significant and featured in an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, This is just one example that demonstrates that our interventions are effective, and U.S. government investments in NGOs that work on gender-based violence are worthwhile and should be continued. Secondly, our experience informs us that GBV prevention and response in times of emergencies must not be seen as optional, but rather a life-saving matter. GBV services are life-saving because when a woman has been raped, she has just 3 days to access care to prevent the potential transmission of HIV, 5 days to prevent pregnancy, and sometimes just a few hours to ensure that life-threatening injuries, do not become fatal. Because emergency response sets the stage for early recovery, a failure to address gender-based violence in the beginning provides a poor foundation for women's resilience and health in the medium and longer term. And it's a barrier to reconstructing the lives and livelihoods of individuals, families, and communities. While it is often thought that women's protection can wait, the reality is the reverse. Women's protection from gender-based violence is most effective when addressed from the very beginning of a crisis. Unfortunately, gender-based violence has not been prioritized in emergencies. For example, IRC found that following the droughts in Kenya, reports of sexual violence increased by 36% between February and May 2012, compared to the previous 3 months in 2 refugee camps on the Somali border. At the same time, funding for gender-based violence there decreased by 50%. Further, a recent protection funding study report commissioned by the Global Protection Cluster revealed that 0.39%, less than 1% of all humanitarian appeal funding from 2007 to 2012 was allocated to GBV interventions. Let us take some learning from this forward now to the Philippines response. Lastly, the United States government has the opportunity to revolutionize humanitarian assistance. The United States government has demonstrated its concern with this panorama and is assuming leadership to take corrective actions. In September, the Department of State announced a joint initiative with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID, Safe from the Start, a roadmap for the United States to take leadership in ensuring transformational change in the way donors, UN agencies, NGOs prioritize and operationalize GBV prevention and response efforts and humanitarian action. from the onset of an emergency. The IRC enthusiastically commends the U.S. government for developing this initiative. Safe from the Start provides a framework that, if followed through, will result in significant changes for women and girls in emergencies. I take this opportunity before the Commission to also share concrete recommendations for the State Department and USAID to consider as they further develop the roadmap. We would appreciate the convening of U.S. government and NGO consultations to ensure that our lessons learned and best practices can be incorporated. It is important to consider the value added of directly financing NGOs that are frontline responders, but who work in collaboration with UN agencies. In addition to the targeted UN agencies who will benefit from Safe from the Start resources, NGOs should be considered for financial support. This will allow the support base and capacity of all actors to grow and take on gender-based violence from the onset of an emergency. Finally, OFDA is a critical partner in humanitarian action. Today, the vast majority of the world's displaced are internally displaced persons, rather than refugees. Being that OFDA has the U.S. mandate to provide life-saving assistance to the internally displaced, OFDA has the potential to influence the mitigation of risks in humanitarian action and reach more survivors. OFDA should play a prominent role in the Safe from the Start roadmap and should invest resources commensurate with its mission and mandate. I'll close by saying that we can keep up the momentum gained in the worldwide fight against GBV through EVAWA, which will be reintroduced tomorrow, as we heard, and we thank you again, Representative Tchaikovsky, for that. The IRC encourages the members of the Commission to consider its swift passage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now hear from Ravi Kant. Welcome.
Honorable Chairperson and members of the Commission, thank you for giving me the opportunity to depose before the Commission. I represent an organization called Shakti Vahini, which works on various issues related to violence against women and children in India. We work very closely with law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, police, government agencies, statutory agencies to combat violence against women and children. In the last 10 years, Shakti Vahini has rescued more than 2,000 victims of human trafficking from various exploitative situations. Brutal rape and subsequent death of a 23-year-old in a crowded area of Delhi, physical and mental torture of a minor housemaid by a highly qualified MNC employee, mysterious death of a tribal girl employed as a domestic help are all instances that have shocked and shook the public conscience in India and has led to massive outpouring of anger. India, being a predominantly patriarchal society, has seen manifestations of violence against women in various forms. While some occur in broad daylight, some happen within the four walls of our houses, nicely hidden in the pretense of morals and traditions. While in India, a country where a large section of people and almost all religions pray to goddesses, we have also high rates of violence against women in various forms. In India, rape cases have been hushed up and not reported due to fear and stigma. The cases which are reported are very poorly investigated and many end up in acquittals. Further, a study of court judgments in rape cases by various courts undertaken by our organization in the last 1 year shows that law enforcement reaction by way of investigation into cases remains at best average and has scope for improvement. States in North India where the sex ratio is below the national average of 940 females per 1,000 males are worst hit by the consequent problems. District-level data indicates increase of case of violence against women. Experts working in the field of women's rights observe that this decline in sex ratio has also shown itself in the growing commodification of daughters in the rigid communities of North India. These communities attach great importance to a woman and consider her as a personification of familial honor. This may sound rosy and flattering at first brush, but this is a heavy burden to shoulder. In the grab of saving family honor, women have been subjected to ridiculous restrictions. Marriage traditionally in India has been arranged, agreed by families and within the caste. Women exercising the right to choice of marriage increasingly become targets of strong community opinions and violence. Many community groups or community panchayats have taken adverse decisions which have led to vitiation of the situation. They also propagate beliefs which curbs the independence of individual to make choices and lead them to resort to law enforcement for their protection. Even court protection has failed to save lives. Scenarios which make women and girls desperate for better life lead to almost negligible options for them, adding to their insecurity and social stigma they are already being subjected to. This is in addition to the state's failure to provide timely justice to victims. Human trafficking. Another grave forms of violence and violation of rights of women and girls is trafficking, which occurs for various purposes like prostitution, forced marriages, labor, adoption, and organ trade. Women without adequate property rights and their enforcement under various special laws are highly dependent on their male counterparts and thus more vulnerable to trafficking. In majority of cases where women end up in exploitative situations, they are lured with promise of marriage, better job opportunities, and means of livelihood. Trafficking in human beings, especially in women and children, has become a matter of grave concern in India. Trafficking is an organized crime which thrives on human misery. In India, despite strong steps being taken by the government of India, the trafficking rackets and gangs have become more organized and expanded into newer forms of trafficking. The crime has expanded in such a way that almost every state is affected with this social and criminal menace. Trafficking for commercial sexual exploitation is also on the increase. West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Odisha, these are the states, continue to be high source areas in trafficking for purpose of sexual exploitation. The missing girls and children data in these states continue to remain high. With the modernization of the commercial sexual exploitation of women and children for the purpose of prostitution, it has gone and changed. The red light areas have continued to be prostitution dense, but the business has expanded out of the red light areas and has become much more organized. By providing services on demand, the operators of sex trade have expanded their business and have started operating from various colonies and using the internet technology. Northeast India has also emerged as a high source area for trafficking of women and children. Girls from various northeastern states have been rescued from various destination states and northern India. There has been an increasing trend of women and children being trafficked from the eastern states for labor. The trafficking of children is being undertaken by illegal placement agencies. Many of these placement agencies are operating from Delhi and National Capital Region. Many of these placement agencies are organized crime rackets specializing in women and child trafficking. They regularly change their addresses as well as the name of the firm to escape prosecution. Due to the skewed sex ratio resulting from female feticide, there has been an increasing demand for marriageable age girls in the states of northern India, which is being met by trafficking from the eastern state. Once the girls are lured into these forced marriages, and once they enter these false and forms of exploitation, including forced marriage, once they enter these false and forced marriages, they are caught in an unending mental and physical trauma. Many rescued victims have narrated their tales of horror, displaced from their culture and social background, which is vastly from those of those states. They become objects of exploitation for the men and their families. Generally addressed as paro, they are not addressed at par with the women of the receiving community and get cut off from all kinds of social ties. The government of India has taken steps to strengthen the law enforcement responses on crime against women and children by bringing in legislation for protection of women and children. After the massive protest which happened after the unfortunate Delhi gang rape in December, the police across the country have notified various procedures to be followed by the law enforcement in investigation, evidence collection, medical examination, and trauma support to victims. The Criminal Amendment Act 2013 has strengthened the law on rape and has also brought in new provisions related to stalking, voyeurism, and acid attacks. The Government of India has ratified the UN Protocol on Trafficking, thus acknowledging the organized nature of this crime. In 2013, the Government of India has amended Section 370 of the Indian Penal Code by defining human trafficking and bringing in very strict punishments for human trafficking. The government has brought various schemes like the Integrated Child Protection Schemes, the Anti-Human Trafficking Units, Victim Compensation Scheme. Also, the Government of India has created fast-track courts for trials related to sexual offenses. Training and sensitization of law enforcement agencies have been taken up by the various police training academies and Bureau of Police Research and Development. In order to have an effect of the new legislations, we have to undertake massive training and sensitization program for the law enforcement agencies on implementation of legislation related to violence against women. We also have to change the mindsets of our law enforcement agencies, including police, prosecutors, and lower judiciary, which is very important so that they understand the sensitivity involved in issues related to violence against women. This is very important as almost 80% of our police stations are spread across the rural areas, away from the glare of the media and social organization. There is an urgent need of reviewing the course curriculum of our law enforcement agencies so that the issues related to violence against women can be prioritized. Each and every crime, as well as the efforts to combat it, has to come from within the society and calls for rapid changes in the perception, mentality, and general conscience of the public and the state. Through the national media and the vernacular media has been highlighting the crimes of violence against women. The government needs to find out ways we can, in greater awareness and sensitivity on issues related to violence against women among the masses. Mr. Chairman, I would also like to bring to your kind notice that your law on human trafficking has created incredible efforts across the world, and a similar law on violence against women is needed. I can say so that this law on trafficking has created an impact in our police training programs, in our sensitization of judiciary, and a lot of things with the support of the United States government. A similar law on ending violence against women will have a focus on violence against women across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Gerda Constant, welcome. We're happy to have you here. It's a privilege.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, esteemed members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, ladies and gentlemen, it is a deep honor to represent the women of Haiti before you today. I give you my thanks to hearing my testimony. My name is Gerda Alexima Constant, and I serve as Executive Director of Fondation Lumière la Vie, Light of Life Foundation. Since 1993, Lumière la Vie has worked to comprehensively address the rest-avec system of child labor exploitation in Haiti. We work with marginalized, largely rural communities to engage in collaborative educational and community development activities that help to build over 1,000 families in 12 communities. The rest-avec system consists of the practice of sending children from poor families to join households in larger cities. Families undertake this practice due to financial hardship, a lack of basic services, and the promise of education opportunities and a better life for their children. However, the families who host rest-avec children do not have the means to support them properly. An estimated 3/4 of children exploited in the rest-avec system are girls. Children in the rest-avec system are often reduced to subhuman status in the household in which they work, as well as in society as a whole. They suffer neglect and physical and psychological abuse. Rest-avec children work from before dawn to late into the evening, often for 14 hours or more, fetching water, hand-washing clothes, carrying heavy loads, working in the fields, caring for smaller children, and preparing meals. Lumière la Vie works to break the silence surrounding the rest-avec system. We work closely with communities for several years. I want to share a little bit about our approach, which will help shed light on the root causes of the rest-avec system. Our community model consists of 5 parts. First, we facilitate open dialogue with communities to establish baseline information collection and engage in education on children's rights. Next, we work with parents to reintegrate children into families and communities and provide accelerated education opportunities for children escaping the reserve system. In order to address the root causes of the reserve system, we work with communities to identify income generation opportunities. Lastly, we establish child protection committees within communities and train community leaders on advocacy techniques to facilitate long-term change. Among global donors, the United States government stands in a unique position to help integrate violence prevention strategies into all its agriculture and economic development programs. In this way, your government can demonstrate that gender-based violence is not a standalone issue. It is deeply woven into the fabric of every single foreign aid investment, whether public or private. This is an example that the US government can and must set for donors in implementing partners around the world. There are 3 cost-effective and immediate steps the United States government could take to demonstrate its great foreign aid leadership in the world and assist the women and children of Haiti and all over the world in the process. Number 1, support a new national protection plan for vulnerable children in Haiti. Following the January 2010 earthquake, over 100,000 children lost the protection of families in Haiti. Hundreds of thousands more children are at risk due to economic hardship and widespread insecurity. Congresswoman Frederica Wilson has introduced a resolution on gender-based violence in Haiti, which urges the U.S. government to continue its support of the Ministry of Women Affairs, national parliament, and grassroots organizations in implementing a new national protection plan for vulnerable children, as well as a law to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. The U.S. can play an important role in working with the Haitian government as it establishes a legal framework to prevent and respond to violence and exploitation. In addition, development assistance and U.S. aid experience in promoting right-based development can be leveraged to support the efforts of the Haitian government to bring this policy framework to life through concrete action. Number 2, invest in local organizations that are getting results. Community-based organizations grow from the roots of society and are closest to the people. Haiti is like a lot of other countries where rural communities are neglected by the government. People in the countryside are not able to have political impact. To change the system in Haiti for the better, it is critical to work with community organizations. In many ways, these organizations fulfill the role of government outside of urban areas. These grassroots groups have the most accurate knowledge of communities, yet they get the least support from outside actors. A small investment yields large returns. Number 3, pass the International Violence Against Women Act. This battle against violence should not depend on the will of a single presidential administration. In order to see real results, it is critical that engagement by the U.S. and Haitian government be consistent over the long term. IVAWA ensures that the efforts of this administration to put into place an effective GBV prevention strategy will become permanent. When women and children are free from violence, individuals, families, communities, and entire countries are stronger and more secure. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank all of you for your excellent testimonies and for bringing attention to an issue that, quite frankly, deserves a lot more attention. And I think this hearing has done a lot to focus not only members of this commission but also members of the administration on the importance of moving forward. I have a few questions, and whoever feels like they want to answer them can answer them. Rather than me pick on individuals one by one, if you have something to say, I'd appreciate it. But let me begin with, I began this hearing by talking about these photographs that you see and that were on display in the Rayburn foyer. It's an exhibit on Congolese girls, and in a place like Eastern Congo, fraught by war. What can we do to help girls like those we saw achieve their potential? Because I think that's a big part of this. How can we do more to help them in the context of war and displacement?
I'll start. Thank you, Chairman. I think, the first step is projects like these that help girls understand the agency, the potential that they have, and envision their futures post-conflict. That's critical to building self-esteem and understanding the power that they have and tapping into their resilience. We work with adolescent girls in most of the countries where we work, and we've developed a program model for working with girls to develop their social human capital, with parents to understand the specific needs of adolescent girls that have survived violence, and also with caregivers, with service providers. The needs that girls have are quite different from women, and one needs to be attuned to that. Thank you.
Ms. Finch, you in your testimony, you said it's critical to note that regardless of whether abuses against women are committed by state or non-state actors, that the state is obliged to condemn, prevent, and punish all acts of violence against women. And in the work that you do with Amnesty International, what have you found to pose the biggest challenges to foreign states holding non-state actors such as employers and partners and husbands, families, friends, and community members responsible for violations of gender-based violence?
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. I think it's a combination of several factors. So discriminatory laws and policies that discriminate against women and girls, lack of rule of law in many countries. So many countries do have legal frameworks for accountability, but unfortunately there are corrupt police officials, there are inadequate judicial systems, et cetera. And then also there's a global culture of discrimination that devalues the lives of women and girls, so norm changing as well, and really working with both women and girls and men and boys to ensure that gender-based violence against men and boys and women and girls stops.
Mr. Khan, it has been nearly 1 year since the gang rape of a young woman in Delhi, and sexual violence in India continues to make global headlines. Some reports indicate that cases of rape have even increased since that infamous case. Can you tell us how NGOs in India are helping to raise awareness about gender-based violence and creating change?
So actually, the increased media attention and the increased government sensitivities to these cases, and the more people are talking about these cases, more and more women and girls are coming out and registering their cases. Earlier, there was non-registration of cases. Now, a lot of them are now coming out and speaking and registering the cases. So this is a big step for us. In fact, with the with the increased sensitivities in the police and the administration. And it is going to increase because people who are not reporting are going to report. Apart from that, organizations like us are discussing it in schools, colleges, universities, reaching out to adolescent girls in the rural areas, talking to them, teaching, making them understand about the different laws which are there to protect them, and also involving the local police authorities with the communities, so that the distance between the law enforcement agency is reducing. We are also trying to reach out to the rural areas to see that the discrimination between boys and girls are ending. We are also involving men in the fight against gender-based violence.
Thank you. This is a question, I think, for everybody, but I'll begin with Ms. Constant. You know, we talk about, everybody's mentioned the U.S. role in combating gender-based violence, and that we, you know, and some of the initiatives that the U.S. has taken. You've talked about some of the funding the United States has provided your organization. I'm just curious, you know, on a country-by-country basis, when you are in a country, obviously, I mean, in Haiti, but for everybody, when you're doing work in a country monitoring gender-based violence, what is the relationship that you have with our embassies? I mean, are our embassies working with you to try to identify some of the most egregious examples of gender-based violence? Are our embassies working with you to bring attention to the governments that are responsible for oversight, that they need to do something? Are we tying, is our foreign aid being used as a strong enough lever to be able to help influence things for the better? Well, we'll begin with you in Haiti. Can you explain to me what the relationship you have between our U.S. people that are on the ground, not just in terms of the funding they provide, but in terms of their advocacy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fondation Lumière la Vie recevoir aide la main partenaire qui États-Unis, Free the Slave, à travers don département d'État.
The foundation receives its aid. Light of Life Foundation receives aid from through the U.S. government. Yes.
Et grâce à aide ça que nous recevons,
thanks to that help, thanks to that aid that we receive,
a
lot of children have been able to reintegrate their families. Many children have been able to get back to their family and move away from the system of Ristavec. We work in 12 communities.
Communauté ça que nous travaillons, nous assurer grâce à aide ça que femmes yo capable chita avec garçons yo pour réfléchir sur problème communauté pa yo et puis prendre décision pour aider communauté yo.
We make sure that the women can sit down in the communities where we work, so they can sit down and debate the issues and reflect on the issues also with the men, so they can try to find resolution on their own.
Grâce à aide ça.
Thanks to this aid,
nous mettons l'école avec un programme d'éducation accélérée.
We built, we came up with new schools with a program of accelerated education.
Dans communauté qui pas gagné l'école du tout.
In communities where there are no schools.
Donc c'est un support qui est vraiment important.
It's a very important support.
Et ça nous remet que organisation locale qui travaille dans communauté rurale yo.
What we'd like is that the local organizations that work in the rural communities,
pour intervention côté institution yo qui travaille en Haïti,
for the intervention of these institutions that work in Haiti,
consulter organisation locale ça yo.
So they can contact, so they can work with these local organizations.
Parce que yo enraciné, yo connaissent problème nan très bien.
Because they are integrated, they know quite well what the issues are.
Yo capable conseiller.
They can give advice.
Yo capable bay vraiment de très bons conseils qui capable orienter aide ça bien.
They can really give excellent advice, so they can really give good orientation to the help, to the aid that's being given.
But just specifically on this whole Restavik issue
Sous question de
that you talked about,
Ou t'as parlé, hein.
how can the United States do a better job in ending child servitude in Haiti?
Comment le gouvernement américain est capable, comment les États-Unis sont capables de faire mieux pour capable finir avec la question de servitude qui
We are providing a great deal of assistance to the government of Haiti.
Nous gouvernement un paquet d'assistance.
Are we doing enough to pressure the government to
Est-ce qu'on a fait un pile pour nous mettre
cooperate with you
pour capable coopérer avec
and to end this terrible practice?
et pour capable finir avec pratique qui horrible ça.
Par exemple, le gouvernement américain supporte Haïti en pile. Et à travers le support ça, le gouvernement américain est capable de pressurer le gouvernement haïtien pour lui assurer que
Comment le fait ça?
nous sommes capables de demander au gouvernement haïtien à travers l'aide que nous avons.
You can ask the Haitian government through the aid that you're offering, that you're giving them,
Assurer que Timonio qui n'a resté avec là,
to ensure that the children that are living in Restavek situation,
c'est un point important dans l'aide ça.
it is a very important point in the aid.
Assurer que violence contre femmes avec petites filles,
Ensure that the violence against women and children and girls,
c'est un point important dans l'aide ça.
it's an important issue when it comes to the aid.
Parce que le problème reste avec là, lié en pile à la situation famille.
Because the issue of Restavek has a great correlation with the reality of the women themselves.
Les femmes sont capables de prendre l'avenir en main, sont capables de décider eux-mêmes.
When the women can take charge of their own future, they can decide on their own.
Sont capables de décider vers les petites pour faire.
They can decide how many children they're going to have.
Sont capables de choisir qui ça yo veulent faire.
They can make a choice of what they want to do.
Donc ça a aidé en pile à diminuer la quantité de petits monde qui dans reste avec.
That will help very much into diminishing the number of children that are living in Restavek.
Thank you. Mr.
Chairman, sir, regarding your question about the engagement of the embassies, we have a very active embassy, the U.S. Embassy. It engages with a lot of grassroots organizations on gender-based violence, human trafficking. We have regular consultations. It also engages a lot with NGOs. And with the NGOs, we also have engaged with the government. At the consular level, at different cities also, there have been a lot of consultation on gender-based violence. And now, just within 1 month time, we are going to have a consultation on the northeast of India to be organized by the U.S. Embassy.
Vigo Walsh, when you're doing work on the ground, what is your analysis of?
I would say that it varies from context to context greatly. It depends on the mission. There are countries where sustained engagement could be of more assistance to the humanitarian community, particularly in countries that are receiving significant U.S. government contributions to security sector reform, to military, and in those countries where perhaps there is human rights abuses being committed by security forces. There is a role there for the embassy to hold the government to account.
Ms. Finch?
Thank you. Yes, I would just add to that also in regards to U.S. foreign aid being used more efficiently. We heard from the first panel about some of the very effective programs that are already in existence. For example, the 24-hour courts in Guatemala, which have helped reduce rates of violence against women. And that's one reason that Amnesty International is recommending passage of the International Violence Against Women Act. It's a way to look at all of these programs, take a multi-sectoral approach, and scale up what is working.
Thank you. Let me just kind of close by asking you: is there anything that you think this commission ought to know that I haven't asked? That's my daughter calling me. That's what that is. But I'm not going to answer right now. But I mean, I'm just kind of in summary. I mean, look, part of what we want to do is, in addition to raise awareness, we also want to compel action. You know, we want to help it make it so intolerable wherever gender-based violence exists that we could actually make progress in stopping it. And so, you know, some of it is funding, obviously, and we need to make sure that the funding is there, and it's, quite frankly, a challenge in this Congress. I wish it wasn't. But part of the reason why this is important, and lots of people are kind of watching these hearings on TV, part of the reason why this is important is because I think not everybody thinks about this issue every day. And, you know, in this government, like in most governments, unless you're in our face, sometimes important issues get neglected. So this is important, and hopefully that will result in additional funding. But also, you know, better coordination, you know, a more consistent response by our embassies across the country to be vocal on these issues and to work with human rights organizations to monitor gender-based violence, regardless of whether the government's our friend or our foe, because sometimes we tend to look the other way when we have a strong military alliance with a country or a strong economic alliance with a particular country, but we ought to be more consistent. But I would leave this kind of last kind of question up to you as to, you know, what is it that what are your final words that you think that we ought to be, you know, we ought to know?
Congressman, thank you so much for asking that question and for the leadership of the Commission. Again, I do think about this issue every day. It's one of the world's most prevalent human rights abuses, but it's not unsolvable. There are solutions. And what I would like Congress to know is that there have been some very good starts by the administration, by Congress. We've got, as we've heard earlier, we have several new strategies: the strategy to end gender-based violence globally, the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. Congress can take the next step by codifying both of those plans and making sure that gender-based violence and ending gender-based violence is a top U.S. diplomatic and foreign assistance priority. This is about making foreign aid more effective and scaling up what we know works. Thank you.
I would like to share that, honestly, I was a bit struck by the lack of discussion around services for survivors today. It's something that the United States government does fund, and there was reference to the need for prevalence data, and I think that we are now at a place where we know that we do not need statistics or prevalence data, incident rates and data to inform us of whether we need funding and programming to respond to the needs of gender-based violence survivors. It happens in every crisis. It's acute, and it needs to become a priority alongside other emergency interventions such as food, shelter, and water.
No, and I think that's a good point. And I think you know, I mean, there's also kind of the added difficulty of responding to gender-based violence in conditions of war or displacement or, you know, refugee crises, and you know, and again, I take your words very seriously on that. So thank you, Mr.
So the United States government should engage more with national governments. We have seen it work in the field of human trafficking, where engagement with our national government has made a lot of things to work. So this engagement needs to be strengthened, and the U.S. government should continue to have active interest in these issues.
Thank you very much. Constant?
Au niveau de législation haïtienne, nous avons une loi qui protège tout le monde, mais il y a une loi qui a besoin de créer, renforcer.
At the legislative level, we have laws that protect children, but we also need to create new laws and to reinforce those that are already in the book.
Pour application loi, par exemple, le gouvernement américain, au niveau, il est capable d'aider, par exemple, le gouvernement haïtien, pressurer pour appliquer la loi qui protège les gens.
The U.S. government could put more pressure on the Haitian government so they can apply the law, so they can enforce the laws.
Nous avons que gagner, ça qui est bon tout, c'est investir dans l'organisation locale qui gagne vraiment de très bons résultats, et nous avons preuve de ça.
We'd like also to invest some more in the local organizations that bring about very good results, and we have the proof already on the ground.
Nous pouvons gagner un plan national de protection de monde, et nous travaillons sur ça. Nous avons un support ça pour ça capable de renforcer l'activité ça.
We don't yet have a national plan for protection of children, but we're working on that, and we'd like to find support in order to make that to get that to become a reality.
Well, thank you very much. And I, you know, look, I do think the United States, you know, in some cases it could put more pressure on governments, but I think it's just as important, and sometimes even more important, for the United States to be supporting local organizations and initiatives designed to combat gender-based violence. I think we need to create movements, support movements, not create movements, because the movements are already there. We've got to support the movements that are all over the world that are demanding that people who are guilty of gender-based violence are held accountable. I mean, people need to be put in jail when they do these terrible things, you know, and there needs to be accountability, and there needs to be education and awareness and sensitivity training. There also needs to be services for those who, you know, who are vulnerable, not just the victims, but those who are potentially vulnerable. So I really appreciate all of your testimonies. I appreciate all the work that you do, and I'll close with saying that what we want to do is make sure that you feel comfortable picking up the phone or emailing this commission and giving us advice on things that we, you know, that we should be talking about. You know, my colleague is, you know, championing the legislative initiative that we all want to see passed. It shouldn't be controversial, but sometimes these things are, and we need to get over that and do the right thing. But even I would invite you to contact us, even if it's on an individual case. You know, we want to support your work. You know, and so I appreciate that, and I just want to before I close, let me see, acknowledge, you know, I've been pointing out all these incredible photographs, but I didn't point out the person who took them. So I want to thank Meredith Hutchison for providing us with these, and you know, I found them very, very moving. But if you haven't had a chance to look at them, please do before you leave. But I want to thank the panel very much and look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Thank you.